Feldwebel Otto Klein braces against the recoil inside his Panzer III. He sights the approaching Soviet tank, an ugly thing, caked in autumn mud. He presses the firing switch. The 50mm shell slams into its sloped hull with a deafening clang, sparks leaping like fireflies. The shot ricochets upward, vanishing into the graying dawn. Klein's loader stares, mouth agape. From across the field, damp earth shudders with every steel tread. Soviet T-34s, their engines howling, advance straight through the muck. Klein blinks sweat from his eyes. He reloads and fires again, point blank. The round bounces high. Another shot, another failure. The tank bears down, utterly undaunted. Panic erupts inside the German turret. "It's invincible," yells the driver. Klein slaps the radio. Direct hit, no effect, requests support. Outside, machine gun fire rattles uselessly against the Soviet armor. The T-34's main gun swings side to side, an indecipherable threat through the fog. Klein's crew scrambles. The loader jams the next shell, the driver grinds the gears, desperate to reverse. Soviet rounds crash around them, muddy water exploding in geysers. Fear seizes the platoon. 3 more shots, each from less than 500 meters, each wasted. Across the line, others report the same. Klein's hands tremble as realization dawns. Pulling back, the scale is clear. On the 9-kilometer front outside Tula, 23 German tanks radio in, shells bouncing, enemy advancing. In sector after sector, Panzer crews face the same impossible foe. It's spreading fast. Inside every steel hull, disbelief gives way to terror. But 72 hours earlier, no one at headquarters believed this could ever happen. 72 hours earlier, spirits soared in the tents of Panzer Group 2. German officers bantered over half-frozen rations, trading jokes about battered Soviet tanks. Lieutenant Frank leaned over a captured T-26 hull, tapping on its flat armor. "Look at this scrap heap," he scoffed, echoing the consensus. Russian machines were outdated, clumsy, and poorly crewed. Reports from engineering headquarters reinforced the confidence. Panzer III and IV models were said to outclass anything the Soviets could field. Veteran crews like Klein's believed their training and weapons would guarantee victory. What they didn't know was how thoroughly they'd been misled. Reconnaissance had underreported Soviet reserves, failing to note hundreds of new tanks hiding beyond Orel. German intelligence distributed outdated specs. Armor thickness, gun range, speed, all wrong. No one bothered to read Sergeant Pavlov's June 20 report of unfamiliar, wide-track tanks moving west of Kursk. Luftwaffe pilots sent in blurry photos, dismissed as errors by ground command. By October 4, over 1,000 T-34s were quietly assembled near Moscow, lying in wait. Every kilometer the Panzers advanced, fate closed the gap. Soviet General Mikhail Kadukov repositioned his units, exploiting thick mud and rolling forests to mask his approach. Trucks ferried anti-tank rounds, radio operators braced for the signal. All the while, German columns, bogged down by rains, engines gutted by grime, marched deeper into the heartland. At 0412 hours on October 6, under sodden skies and thinning nerves, they would discover the truth. The sun never quite rises through the October mist, but by 0412 hours, Klein's squad is ready. The first metallic shapes stagger into view through the birch trees. Radio crackles, unidentified tanks bearing 080. Klein relays orders, unease tightening his grip. They open fire. The first shot clangs off sloped armor, no penetration. Klein blinks, impossible. Within seconds, Soviet guns answer. The ground leaps. A Panzer IV, 50 meters to the right, erupts in flame. Across the line, voices transmit confusion and shock, cannot stop them. The problem grows by the minute. T-34s pour across the front, at least 16 in Klein's nearest sector. Radios jam as platoons shout over each other, request air support. Ammo ineffective. Reports flood in, Panzer engines bogged down, tracks spinning uselessly in gluey mud. Klein sees another shell bounce, whistling away. One crew bails out just before their vehicle is hit, the turret exploding skyward. At headquarters, General Guderian listens, grim and silent. Tank after tank is lost, not to fire but to breakdowns and desperation. Then, realization sets in, this is no fluke. Every sector repeats the nightmare. The myth of German invincibility collapses in the mud outside Moscow. Guderian breaks radio silence, all units to defensive positions. Repeat, defensive. The clock starts. This was only the first hour. What happened over the next 6 hours would force the entire German army to rewrite its doctrine. 04:35 hours. Southeast of Yasnaya Polyana, Panzer Group 2's 8th Company attempts a flanking maneuver to stem the Soviet advance. Lieutenant Müller leads 3 tanks through a copse of birch, hoping to catch the Soviet left exposed. As they emerge, their formation falters. Mud seizes one Panzer III, track spinning helplessly. Seconds later, the lead T-34's cannon booms. Shrapnel slices overhead. Müller's command tank takes a glancing hit. The shell gouges deep, but does not penetrate. His gunner fires twice. Both rounds ricochet again. The order to pull back comes over the crackling net, another company immobilized by mud, not enemy fire. The front has not stabilized. It's dissolving. Across the front, Soviet crews experience sudden disarray. Tank commander Fedotov recalls, "Our radios failed in the mist. We saw flashes, sometimes friend, sometimes foe. Confusion reigns as units struggle to maintain lines. One T-34 drives straight into a marsh and vanishes. Commanders shout over open hatches, signaling with flares and flags. Even so, the Soviet attack presses on. The Germans, pinned down and struggling, appear vulnerable, but Fedotov and his crew cannot communicate their position or receive fire support. Smoke cloaks the fields. No one is certain who holds the crest above Tula. By 0700 hours, the turning point becomes clear. A barrage of 40 T-34s breaks through the German 17th Panzer Division's southern flank. Within 35 minutes, 15 Panzers are knocked out, 8 destroyed, 7 abandoned in mud. German anti-tank guns fire at close range, rounds spark off Soviet armor. The defenders waver. By 0735 hours, a 2-kilometer stretch falls to Soviet control. The Germans retreat in disorder, losing more ground in 3 hours than the entire previous week. Soviet casualties are high, at least 20 tanks disabled, but their momentum is relentless. At division headquarters, communication is frantic. Major Stange receives contradictory reports. Sector collapsed. Request airstrike. Minutes later, Luftwaffe coordination fails. Fog and chaos obscure targets. Stange orders a withdrawal to a secondary line at 0740 hours, relaying via motorcycle couriers when radios jam. Division command loses real-time contact with frontline units. By the time General Guderian receives a complete breakdown, the outcome is already beyond immediate recovery. The core technical factor behind the German debacle lay in the mismatch between Panzer armament and the Soviet T-34's revolutionary design. The Panzer III's 50mm KW-K38 gun, with an armor penetration of 61mm at 500 meters, and the short-barreled Panzer IV's 75mm, designed for infantry support, were both woefully inadequate against the T-34's 45mm sloped steel hull. German shells routinely failed to penetrate at any angle greater than 30 degrees due to the high obliquity and hardness of the Soviet armor. German testing protocols had never accounted for face-hardened, sloped plates of this thickness and geometry. Pre-war doctrine assumed engagement ranges and armor profiles more typical of older models like the T-26 and BT series. Strategically and tactically, the German command underestimated both the concentration and the technical quality of the Soviet armored forces. Decisions at Army group level, particularly by General Guderian's staff, were made using outdated February 1941 intelligence, stating that Soviet main battle tanks possessed no more than 30mm frontal armor, a critical error. Consequently, the plan committed thinly spread panzer divisions into unsuitable terrain, confident that speed and maneuver would offset any Soviet resistance. Where earlier operations in France and the Balkans had seen success by exploiting flanking speed, boggy terrain, and enemy depth at Tula sapped German momentum. Unlike prior adversaries, the Soviets massed new T-34s and crewed them by soldiers with surprisingly effective basic training, defying expectations. Evidence from captured Soviet tactical diaries and post-war German interrogations supports this. One German tank commander later recalled, "We hit them again and again, but they kept coming." Quantitative analysis shows that, while the Germans lost at least 32 tanks that morning, only 9 Soviet tanks were completely destroyed in the same period. The stark contrast in loss rates and operational readiness had not been foreseen by either side's pre-war calculations. By midday, the German 17th and 18th Panzer divisions regroup at defensive positions 3 kilometers west of their morning lines. Over 2,100 troops are tasked to dig anti-tank ditches, while mobile reserves consolidate at backup strongpoints near Yasnaya Polyana. Orders from Army Group Command prioritize holding the new line, with all available anti-tank guns shifted south to meet the ongoing threat. Luftwaffe sorties are grounded by persistent fog. Air cover is suspended until visibility improves. Intercepted Soviet communications report additional armored columns converging from the northeast, prompting an emergency redeployment of the divisional artillery. At headquarters, General Guderian receives fragmented updates. By 1300 hours, confirmation arrives of the southern sector's collapse and the urgent need for reinforcements. Guderian issues a direct order: no further counterattacks until new 88mm flak batteries are in place. Field commanders are instructed to prioritize anti-tank defense and to evacuate damaged vehicles for salvage. Reports from frontline liaison officers underscore the crisis. Standard guns are ineffective. Request new ammunition types urgently. Strategic reserves are authorized to begin rail movement from Orel within the next 24 hours. By the end of the day, the German losses stand at 43 tanks destroyed or abandoned, with 430 personnel killed or missing. Soviet records estimate their own armored losses at 29 tanks destroyed and 48 disabled. The Germans relinquish control of 5 key villages and a 10-kilometer stretch south of Tula. Operational schedules for the overall Moscow offensive are set back by at least 48 hours, forcing a hasty reassessment of both logistics and tactics. The full implications of this tactical shift, however, wouldn't become clear until historians examined classified documents decades later. Fact 1. Personal account among the preserved papers of Obergefreiter Fritz Baden, a panzer loader in the 17th Division. A torn, mud-stained diary entry surfaced in a Moscow archive after the Cold War. On October 6th, Baden wrote, "Shells spark off as if we throw pebbles at iron. Loader and gunner curse louder at each failure. My ears ache, smoke everywhere." For decades, such ground-level perspectives were lost or censored. Only in 1994 did a Russian-German research group catalog these frontline diaries, casting new light on hour-by-hour soldier experience beyond official reports. Fact 2. Logistical reality. German quartermaster logs uncovered at the Bundesarchiv reveal that, despite official statements of adequate 50mm and 75mm shell reserves, 17th and 18th Panzer divisions entered the battle at Tula with less than 46% of authorized armor-piercing rounds, 2,100 out of an expected 4,600. Field returns cite 86 tanks left waiting on supply trucks still mired near Orel. The result? Many vehicles engaged T-34s firing high-explosive shells or with empty racks, undercutting German firepower at critical moments. Fact 3. Official versus actual records. The initial after-action report to Army Group Center on October 7 downplayed the severity, mentioning only unexpected armor resistance and loss of 19 tanks. Soviet document captures, now in the RGVA, Moscow, and later German salvage records, however, show at least 43 German tanks lost or abandoned within a 12-hour span, with higher casualties not admitted until weeks later in internal memoranda. Analysts point to a pattern of official understatement to maintain morale and obscure operational failures. Fact 4. Ground-level reality. Multiple tank crew accounts, Bundesarchiv oral histories, and post-war French interviews describe improvisation. Crews stacking ammunition crates under gun mounts to achieve steeper firing angles, or chaining logs to tank hulls as makeshift anti-mine protection. None of these tactics appeared in German training manuals, yet they recur across dozens of testimony from Tula, signifying a systemic adaptation to battlefield realities missed by high command. Fact 5. Environmental factor meteorological logs from Soviet 16th Army, recently declassified, indicate a 4-day rainfall totaling 58 millimeters preceded the battle, double the monthly average. The result: a cloying mud, Rasputitsa, immobilized dozens of Panzers, far worse than planners forecasted. Panzer III transmissions seized up after just 2 hours, while Soviet wide-tracked T-34s, designed for such muck, continued with high operational rates. This environmental mismatch intensified German losses and collapsed their mechanized doctrinal tenets. In the immediate post-war years, Western historians depicted the battle south of Tula primarily through German memoirs and official Wehrmacht communiques. The dominant narrative stressed German operational skill, thwarted by sheer Soviet numbers and unfavorable weather. Early monographs such as von Mellenthin's and accounts in Panzer Leader relied heavily on after-action reports drafted under censorship or psychological strain. With Soviet archives closed, Western researchers leaned on interviews with German officers, emphasizing the supposedly unanticipated appearance of the T-34 and portraying events as a brief aberration amidst overall German competence. The understanding began to shift with declassification of both Soviet and German archival materials in the 1970s-90s. Access to captured document troves, including Soviet tank, brigade combat logs, and German quartermaster records, revealed systemic intelligence failures, logistical breakdowns, and higher casualty rates than previously acknowledged. Eyewitness diaries and battlefront letters, such as Fritz Baden's, were published, painting a vivid portrait of confusion, improvisation, and despair within both armies. Soviet historiography, spearheaded by figures like Rotmistrov and updated by Western scholars including Glantz, highlighted the operational intent and technical expertise behind Soviet armored tactics, shifting agency away from German command alone. Today, consensus among specialists recognizes this engagement as the first major demonstration of the T-34's superiority and its psychological effect on Wehrmacht morale. Scholars broadly agree that the scale of German tank losses and the collapse of offensive schedules were far greater and more structurally significant than initial accounts admit. Debate remains regarding Soviet crew effectiveness. Some historians argue crew inexperience dampened the T-34's impact, while others stress nascent tactical innovation. However, few dispute that these October battles forced a doctrinal overhaul in German armored warfare and marked the beginning of a sustained Soviet resistance rooted in material as much as manpower. Individual 1, primary focus. Obergefreiter Ernst Vogler, age 23, 8th Company, 17th Panzer Division, was born in Kassel, Germany. As a mechanic's apprentice before the war, he joined the army seeking advancement. During the battle near Tula, his diary details the terror as both commander and loader. Mud swallows us. Every shot like thunder. The T-34 I hit does not burn. I pray and curse, my hands shake, we want to run. Vogler was wounded by shrapnel and captured while trying to retreat through a swamp. He spent nearly 4 years in Soviet captivity before returning home, crippled but alive, in 1947. His testimony, archived at the Kassel Municipal Archives and the Bundesarchiv, is cited in multiple recent histories. Individual 2, enemy perspective. Lieutenant Sergei Fedotov, commander of a T-34 in the 32nd Tank Brigade, experienced radio failure and near-complete disorientation during the same clash. We fired at flashes, sometimes Germans, sometimes the ground. When my tank jammed in mud, we used signal flares to call help. Fedotov survived, later rising to battalion command, and provided an oral history to the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1982. His account reveals both the chaos and initiative that characterized Soviet armored units. Individual 3, long-term impact. Lieselotte Brenner, age 29, was a nurse in the German Rear Medical Detachment when her fiancé, Panzer Officer Hans Mayer, was recorded as missing at Tula. Like many, she suffered prolonged anxiety, later manifesting as Kriegstrauma, war trauma. Lieselot's testimony, shared decades later, describes how countless families experienced similar loss and ambiguity. Her coping strategies, and the later emergence of support groups in 1950s West Germany, typified post-war shifts in mental health policy and served as early models for trauma counseling among veterans and their families. These individual experiences, when examined across hundreds of documented cases, revealed patterns that shaped strategic decisions throughout the campaign. Within just 6 hours of Feldwebel-Klein's shells bouncing off T-34 armor at 0412 hours, German command faced an operational shock. At 740 Soviet tanks pierced the southern flank, forcing the 17th Panzer Division into hasty withdrawal and leaving a 2-kilometer breach. Defensive orders cascaded down the line. Anti-tank ditches dug, reserves repositioned, and anti-tank guns shifted. Luftwaffe sorties halted, and emergency ammunition requests multiplied. By noon, more than 2,100 German troops were retasked to entrenchments, while divisional artillery realigned for rapid defense, a wholesale shift within just hours. By the close of October 6th, the immediate tactical disaster translated rapidly into strategic disruption. 5 villages and 10 kilometers of ground fell in less than 12 hours. German casualty rates, 43 tanks and over 400 men by day's end, exceeded all prior projections for the week. Ammunition and fuel shortages, already critical, worsened as supply convoys bogged down in the same cloying mud. The German southern Moscow offensive, originally timed for an advance at dawn on October 7, was rescheduled, delayed at least 48 hours with fresh orders prioritizing infantry-held lines and salvage operations. The Soviets pressed advantage, expanding salient penetration by dusk on October 8. In the ensuing weeks, the failure to overcome Soviet armor forced High Command to alter the projected timeline for Operation Typhoon. Reinforcements, specifically new 88mm flak batteries, were redirected from other critical sectors, reducing offensive pressure on both Leningrad and Rostov. Several regimental and battalion commanders were summarily relieved or reassigned, blamed for underestimating the Soviet tank threat. Promotions slowed, and new contingency doctrines were quickly drafted, mandating combined anti-tank and infantry response training. Territorial losses included road junctions essential for winter supply. Ultimately, this single battle irreversibly altered the German timetable for the entire Eastern campaign. Delays at Tula enabled Soviet reserves to rearm Moscow's defenses, negating months of German momentum. By winter, resources intended for a rapid push to the Volga had been absorbed in makeshift anti-tank upgrades and logistical overhaul. Years later, Wehrmacht doctrine was rewritten to account for sloped armor. Strategic initiative on the Eastern Front never fully returned to German hands after those muddy, panicked hours near Tula. Had the German Panzer divisions broken through the T-34 corridor outside Tula, the entirety of Operation Typhoon's advance might have unfolded on schedule. Without the paralyzing shock of the T-34's armor, Army Group Center could have exploited its flanking maneuver, likely enveloping Soviet 16th Army in the first week of October. Casualty estimates suggest German armored losses would have been reduced by at least 2/3, while Soviet tank attrition might have doubled. A successful German penetration could have placed Moscow's southern districts within artillery range by late October, allowing a converging attack before Soviet defensive consolidation. In comparison to other pivotal WWII battles, such as Prokhorovka or Arakwart, the Tula engagement was numerically smaller, involving roughly 100 armored vehicles a side rather than thousands. Yet its disproportionate impact stemmed from the technical and psychological rupture it induced. Where the Somme or Kursk shifted campaign momentum through massed force, Tula's value lies in the introduction of a battlefield technology and the collapse of doctrinal confidence. Loss rates, over 40% for German tanks within a single morning, compelled an urgent doctrinal review, making this action required study for officers at both the Bundeswehr Führungsakademie and Russian armor schools. Tactical adaptability and intelligence failures from Tula echo through case studies on operational inflexibility. Historians broadly concur that the battle near Tula represented the Wehrmacht's irrecoverable loss of armored initiative. The major debate centers on attribution. Some specialists, like Glantz, emphasize Soviet operational foresight, while others, notably Ziemke, stress German hubris and logistical limitations. Current consensus deems the Tula engagement as the first unequivocal demonstration of the T-34's battlefield dominance, a moment that catalyzed the re-examination of every aspect of German armored warfare from production to tactics. Secondary debate endures regarding the relative inexperience of Soviet crews, offset by the qualitative leap in hardware. Obergefreiter Ernst Vogler survived the chaos near Tula, wounded, captured, and ultimately returned home in 1947 after years in Soviet camps. Vogler's post-war life in Kassel was marked by chronic pain and a dedication to documenting his ordeal. In a 1962 interview preserved by the Bundesarchiv, he reflected, "No shell I loaded could save us. On that day, we learned fear had metal teeth." Vogler's diaries and interviews are now featured in Kassel's Municipal Museum, anchoring local remembrance ceremonies each fall. Institutionally, the shock of Tula is immortalized at the Armor Museum in Munster, where a preserved T-34 and captured Panzer III stand side by side, reminders of mutual vulnerability. The Tula Tankers Memorial, dedicated in 1975 on the southern outskirts of the city, hosts annual joint Russian-German commemorations, fostering reconciliation and scholarship. Since 1979, lessons from Tula have been incorporated into Bundeswehr and Russian military curricula, explicitly referenced in German Panzerabwehr, anti-tank, doctrine updates of 1981, and Soviet armored tactics revisions from 1984. After the Cold War, both nations' staff colleges began co-hosting Tula-focused tactical simulations.